Hi everybody, welcome to the monthly OutMatch webinar series. I'm your host, Dan Houts. OutMatch delivers the data that's missing from your hiring process. With clear, measurable insight into candidates and new hires, you will make better hiring decisions and your organization will finally be able to measure the impact of hiring on your company. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type them into the GoToWebinar queue as always, or you can get us on Twitter at OutMatchHCM with the hashtag OutMatchInsights. That's hashtag OutMatchInsights for questions, and we'll monitor it through our Twitter handle at OutMatchHCM. We'll address those questions at the end of the presentation. Happy everybody could make it with us today. I'm excited to introduce today's presenter, Jason Ferrara, the Chief Marketing Officer here at OutMatch. Jason not only has a background in human capital management, but also is building technology solutions to solve human capital challenges. Jason?
Thanks, Dan, and thank you for everyone for being on the webinar today. Today we're going to discuss the 6 best practices for talent selection. So these best practices are designed to help you build a measurable talent selection process, a process that drives insight and also helps you understand the impact of the people that you're hiring. Now, when we talk about talent selection, I want to make sure that we're clear that, you know, the way that I'm referring to talent selection in this particular webinar is any open position that you need to fill, whether you're filling that with an internal employee who's changing from one role to another, or whether you're hiring people from outside of your company. And really, either way, you're running a very similar process, and these best practices apply to either of those scenarios. You know, what's most important, regardless of it internal or external, is that these best practices really help you think critically about your selection process. Think critically about what you're trying to accomplish with your selection process and how effective that selection process is. First, I want to talk a little bit about why best practices for talent selection is important to begin with. You know, time to fill is one of the real big problems we have as human capital professionals. Research is telling us that jobs that are not filled within 30 days have a very good chance of being open for 90 days. Now, for all of us who are hiring managers or putting together responsible for that talent selection process, that is like a kick in the gut, right? If I don't fill it in 30 days, it's going to be open for 90 days. And this is a problem for a variety of reasons, right? And one, I mean, the first big reason is that's going to hurt your business. Let's put this in context of sales. If you have a sales position that's going to be open for 90 days, well, your board of directors is not going to adjust your revenue number because you're down a salesperson, right? They're going to expect the same output whether you're down a salesperson or not. And if you're down a salesperson, what happens then, right? What basically happens then is that slack has to get picked up by other salespeople or by sales management. If you run a restaurant and you're short a server or two, what has to happen? Other people have to pick up shifts, right? They're running faster. They're working harder. They're probably not as effective or as effectively selling as they could be. So, you know, time to fill is a problem because it's going to potentially hurt the revenue of the business. Second is that open jobs affect the candidate experience that you have, right? So candidates do this sort of thing. They look at a job, they look online, find that job at one of your sources, and then they come back and they may see it. They may see it open after a couple of weeks. That isn't unusual. But open after a couple of months, and candidates begin to say things like, gosh, that company's really having a hard time hiring someone for that role. I wonder what the problem is. Now, for evergreen positions like server, maybe that isn't as often the case. But for other positions that aren't necessarily evergreen, that you can understand this is a one-time hire, that's what candidates say. And they notice those open positions. And so they're thinking through the candidate experience and your recruitment brand and the brand of your organization, and there's impact there. And then third, open positions lead to, will tell you that you have leaks in a funnel. I mean, I'm a human capital professional. What I do at OutMatch is marketing, and so I think in terms of funnel all the time, right? I want to get as many people in the top of the funnel and have them convert and come out the bottom. And really, as human capital professionals, that's what we're doing as well. And when you have jobs that take a long time to fill, that is indicative of leaks in your funnel. And so to find the leaks in the funnel, that's an analytical process. That means you have to understand your process well enough to understand the numbers that are in the process and to understand what those leaks actually might be. So think like a marketer in that sense. Another reason why time to fill will be a problem. And so as we think about best practices and we think about these issues of jobs taking a long time to fill, we need to begin to ask ourselves some really key questions. Right? And it really should start, the key questions really need to start with, is my hiring strategy as effective as it could be? Am I bringing in the right talent? Or am I really just focused on meeting my quota, right? I have a quota to hire X amount of people at a certain amount in a certain amount of time. What we want to make sure is that our strategy is as effective as it could be. And so here on this slide, there are some of the questions that we need to entertain, right? Is my process too long? Am I giving a negative candidate experience because my process is too long or because my process is confusing? Am I gathering worthless references? Do I feel like my reference checking process is not providing me with data? Gosh, if that's happening, A, that's easy to fix, but B, it's disheartening to say I'm doing this thing and it's not resulting in data. So you want to examine that part of the process. Do I have a revolving door of candidates? Or if you think about a building and a revolving door, my children, what they like to do with the revolving door, and for those of you with children or people who have been out and about in the world, you've seen kids do this, they get in the revolving door and they just want to go around and around and around and around and around. And if that's happening with your candidates, if you're seeing them over and over and over again, that's a problem, right? Because you're not able to identify and weed out candidates. Or the flip side of that is, are you swimming in a sea of candidates? I've got so many resumes, I don't know what to do, I can't evaluate them all. I'm really having a difficult time with that part of the process. The question of I don't really know my candidates. Of course you have their resume, and of course you're going to interview people. Those are pretty standard parts of a process. But are you really getting to know these people and whether or not they've done a job? If you have a hard time saying, I know that person, I know they could do the job because of the experience I've gotten through my interviews, if you can't say those things, then you've got inefficiency in that process. Can apply some best practices to this. If you're not using competencies to evaluate talent, this is a great place to begin to apply best practices, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. And it's not just about, did I select the right person today? It's also about, did this person stay as a productive employee in my organization? If you have new hires that aren't staying, that is an indication that your selection process isn't selecting the right people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. So here are the best practices. There are 6 of them. Make sure your job criteria makes sense. Look at a candidate's job potential, not just their past experience. Stop doing casual, unstructured interviews. Check references without wasting time, and we'll get into the importance of reference checking and how that can be used to gather data. Factor candidate experience into the total ROI of your selection process. And then you want to begin to gather performance data before the one-year review. I was talking to a colleague about this best practice and they said 1 year, they didn't use the word heck, but I put it in here to be a little more politically correct. They said, you gotta start checking this 90 days in. Now, if you don't have this data within 90 days, you're at risk of losing somebody. So that's the 6th best practice there. But before we get started, I'd like to think a little through this a little bit and just take a poll in your head about which of these best practices you think are most important to you and where you think you need the most help. Now the reality is, and usually in polls like this, there's a little poll, you get to click on it, isn't that fun, I see the data. But the reality is, when I've asked people, when I travel and I talk to people about best practices, what I hear is all of these things are important, all of these things are challenging at various times in multiple processes. So at some point, making sure the job criteria makes sense is the most important thing. Is it a new role? In that new role, what does that really mean? And some people have just thrown in the towel on reference checking. Or some people are doing interviews, they're not sure how to optimize those interviews and the times that people spend there. So I look at this list, I say, all these things are important, and all these things are worthy of our time. So let's start talking about the first best practice. All right, so good hiring decisions start with good hiring criteria. I mean, that may seem evident, but it's not always the case. That as hiring professionals or hiring managers, we take the time to make sure we understand and develop the criteria. And so you want to ask, what makes a person succeed in this position? Again, a very simple question, but it's a multifaceted question, because it is not one thing makes a person succeed. There are multiple things, and you have to understand what those are to really get the most out of your candidates. For example, is experience more important in this role than education? Oh, that's a real question. Just because I have a graduate degree from a top 10 school, does that mean I'm going to be more successful in this role than someone who does not, but that someone who does not has 10 more years of working experience in a similar type role? Those are very important questions to ask and to answer. So instead of making assumptions, we want to ask that question. What makes a person succeed in this position? So the first thing we want to do is we want to be building competency criteria, right? We want to begin to define job success. We want to understand the traits for a new hire. And we want to understand that people internally or externally have competencies that will help them fit into a role. And these are 3 areas on the screen here that are essentially reasons for developing competencies and understanding success criteria. Right? First of all, competency-based selection favors diversity. And what we mean here is competency-based selection focuses on behaviors rather than backgrounds or other experiences. Because what we want to know is, in this job, how will someone behave? Not someone from this area of the country, someone who has this past experience. We really want to understand those innate characteristics and traits. So competency-based selection favors diversity. Second, competency-based selection has a tendency to build standard question sets, standard parts of your process. And when you're building standard parts of your process and questions, you can generate that consistency across the process, and you can create a process that is much more scalable. Right? So if you have a geographically diverse organization and you create a process based on competencies, you can begin to drive consistency across the organization because you're building a consistent process, and that scale will speed up and you'll deliver better, more effective candidates and hires. And then the third piece, competencies can identify transferable skills in new hires and existing employees. So I'm going to keep going back to this theme of selection just doesn't mean bringing someone new in the organization. Selection is also about filling open positions with internal candidates. And this is where competencies are so helpful. You know, transferable skills, most often I hear about transferable skills when you talk about military hiring, right? There's a skill that someone learned in the military that they can apply to the private sector and be great in that role. But this also exists outside of military hiring, that people have transferable skills. Sales is one of those, right? Your competency, which is an ability to convince somebody to buy something, is transferable across a variety of companies, a variety of products. The other thing that's important about transferable skills and competencies to uncover those transferable skills is that when you need to build a team internally, and you need a team that has complementary competencies. I need to put together a team of someone who's persuasive and someone who can do the work, right? If I have competency information on those people, that helps me build that team a lot faster. So let's look at some specific competencies. All right, what's here is a competency model specifically for a restaurant manager, but I think what you'll see is that these types of competencies in a different mix. You know, my children are super into the Harry Potter series right now, and they all go to this potions class, right? And they mix a bunch of ingredients to make a potion. That's sort of like what we're doing here with competencies, right? Different roles have different competencies, and you mix them together to find the perfect solution to your hiring problem. And if you look here, in-depth problem solving and analysis, championing change, business acumen, planning and organizing, driving for results, customer focus, managing others. I know you can read these things, relationship management. These are all separate competencies. And what you want to see when you look at these separate competencies is the strength that someone has within each competency. You know, in most jobs, you don't score 100% on every competency. That'd sort of be boring, right? You need people to actually have skills that they need to improve upon, and you need complementary skill sets within your organization. But in this example, for restaurant manager, right, you need someone who has customer focus and also can manage others, right? Just think about those two different sets of competencies. I care deeply about my customers, and that's where my general focus is. But I'm also able to talk to my team and treat them in a customer way and manage them to success. So building competency criteria is very important. Building these competencies is important. This is something, you know, if you have the right people internally, you can build competencies yourselves. If you don't, you can hire people to build competency models for you. People who do that typically are IO psychologists. You know, they'll build models around these competencies, and then you'll know this competency will predict success in a specific role. So defining the job criteria, what makes a person succeed in a position, right? And that leads to competencies which help build consistency, help build clarity in your hiring process. So that's the first best practice. Second best practice is look at job potential, not just past experience. So think about the candidate in this sense. Does the candidate have the potential to be good at the job they're applying for? And how do you measure that? How are we going to know that? And then, what do I measure? I mean, if I figured out how I'm going to measure it, I also have to figure out what I'm going to measure at the same time. And the reality is there are so many tools out there to measure things with. What is it that you really need to be measuring? So let's talk quickly about how to measure the right variables. All right, so defining success on the job, you have to align success across the business also. You can't have I know the perfect skill and behavior competency set for someone who's in sales and someone who's developing our piece of software, and we've never talked among the management team about that set of competencies. Right? You don't want to do that. You want to align across because this competency work in defining success also plays into culture and plays into the way that people work together as a team. So what do we measure, and how do we measure those things? We want to measure competencies and behaviors. We've already talked about that, defining competencies and then giving a candidate an assessment that measures those competencies. A similar type of assessment can measure their personality, measure their cognitive ability, right? Are they smart enough to do the job, essentially? For some of our positions that we hire for, that we work with our clients to hire for, an example of cognitive ability is, can you read a P&L statement? Can you read a profit and loss statement? And it's not just read it. Yeah, I know that these words have meaning, but it's understanding the profit and loss statement and then analyzing the impact of that. If you're a restaurant manager, for example, you need to be able to read the profit and loss statement, understand where that location, how that location is performing, and if you manage multiple locations, you need to understand how multiple locations are performing within the context of each other and within the context of the larger organization. There are culture fit assessments. Structured interviewing is also a type of assessment done properly, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. And then past reference, right? That's also a type of assessment. So those are the types of variables that you want to be able to measure, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to measure those. One of the reasons you want to identify these variables and why you want to begin measuring these variables is because they're going to build more certainty in your selection process and less variability and less risk in that selection process. That's why we want to find these variables. So let's talk specifically about measuring competencies and understanding how to make sense of that data. So we'll look specifically at a report from an assessment for the competency of decisive judgment. Decisive judgment has several traits associated with it: fact-based, realistic, serious-minded, self-reliance, and assertiveness. And you see here we're scoring a person who's taken this assessment along a set of measures, right? Green, good; yellow, you might want to dig into it; red is a red flag, to use the word red too many times in a row. But this is the type of data that you uncover when you identify and then you begin to measure competencies. So now I know that where this person falls for the competency of decisive judgment. And I can make a determination around what's most important for me. Obviously, this person scores well in fact-based and realistic and assertiveness. I want to dig in a little bit more on serious-minded and self-reliance, right, and see what that means in relationship to this person and to the role. Now, how we do that? So you've got this data on where they score out on the competency, but then you take this one step further and you apply this to the interview. So you see 3 questions on this page. To the right, there's a question under interview questions. That interview question is general to the competency overall. Underneath the scales, you see additional special probes. Those questions are based on the competency scores above. So those questions are about serious-minded and self-reliance. So once you've measured the competency, then you can take that next step and begin talking to that candidate about where they fit. And you can do something with this data, right? It's not just collecting data for data's sake. It's that you can do something with that data. So that's the second best practice, right? Looking at job potential, not just past experience. Measuring the potential of an individual, of a candidate. The third best practice is to stop doing casual, unstructured interviews. I mean, there are two things that happen when you do a casual or you do an unstructured interview. Thing number one is you as the interviewer, you don't learn anything. You think you do, then you go back to analyze it, like I really didn't learn anything from that person, from that interview. And the second is the candidate sits across from you and listens to you and watches you ask unrelated, borderline cockamamie questions, and they say, do I really want to work here? That interview seemed like not in line with what I thought the company was or what I thought the job was. Those are two really dangerous things to come out of an interview. Those are time wasters, right? It hurts efficiency. It hurts candidate experience. So what you want to do is stop doing those types of interviews. You want to do an interview that focuses on job criteria, focuses on past behavior. So you want to ask things like, describe a situation in which you've met an aggressive goal, right? A very specific, tell me about when you have exhibited this behavior in the past. Don't ask hypotheticals, right? What would you do if you're starting a sentence that way, a question that way? You are not going to get at the root of that person's competencies, because those are questions that can be engineered by the job seeker. You want to ask very specific, hard-hitting, describe a situation for me. That's the most important thing. So one of the things we want to talk about with unstructured interviews, one of the reasons why we want to stop unstructured interviews, one of the things why we want to talk about interviews in the first place is that interviews are a place where bias exists and bias comes to the forefront. What we want to be able to do is reduce bias. Right? Anytime we can reduce our personal biases or organizational biases, whatever it is, it exists. We got to reduce that. Structured interviews will help you reduce the bias that exists. Now, there are several types of biases, and in order to really talk about biases properly, what's important is to talk about the types of biases that exist. What do you mean there are biases in my interview process? That can't be. I talk to people all the time about that. And then you describe some of them and say, oh, yes, yes, yes. I understand that. I've heard about that. I have a friend, who's done that before. So I think it's important to talk about the introduction of bias in interview process and how unstructured interviews are full of that. One is prejudging, right? I'm going to create an impression of this person before I've ever met them, or very shortly after I've met them, right? Prejudging bias can happen within 7 seconds of meeting someone. Research shows it's about a 7-second period of time in which someone can make that first impression and where that prejudging bias is formed. Halo and horn, which seems sort of a goofy name for a bias, essentially means you think this person is all bad or you think this person is all good. And the reality is that's not how people are. People are a blend of their strengths and weaknesses, right? People have things they're good at and things they're not good at. And you want to be able to get into the nuance there. If you think about hiring and people on your team, almost as like a family, right? You know these things about your family members. You know they're not all bad or all good. That's the way we have to treat, candidates when we hire them. Like really understand that. Try to resist that temptation for the halo and horn effect. Projection. Like prejudging, but projection is more along the lines of, this person reminds me of my buddy who's a very aggressive salesperson, so this person must be an aggressive salesperson. I'm projecting what I know about someone in a similar situation or similar role onto this candidate. That's dangerous. You just don't get to the bottom of who the person is. And that's what's so important about an interview. And then generalizing. Right? This is the most common of the biases. You're a salesperson, so you're going to be aggressive. Let's just say that's a generalization, right? That's a stereotype of salespeople. That may or may not be the case, but if you generalize all of a sudden, then you've created this bias that's very difficult to get over. And as I said, it's the most common, right? And sometimes generalizing isn't negative. Sometimes generalizing is, oh, that person must be like me because they've had this experience, and so because they're like me, that's great. You know, that is also generalizing, and that is also a bias, and that also does not get to the bottom of the candidate and really get to what will make that candidate successful in that job, right? You're trying to match the right person with the right job here, so we got to get beyond the bias. So there are some secrets to conducting a structured interview. And as I was building the presentation, and I was looking at various lists of secrets, I found this list that I really enjoy. It's from the State Department, which was surprising. I don't think of the State Department when I think of selection process, but they hire a lot of people, and those people have to be good at what they do, right? Think about mission critical. These are mission critical jobs. So you're going to base your questions on job analysis, and that's a little bit of that define what success means on the job that we were talking about earlier, right? That's going to ensure fairness. That's going to ensure impartiality in the job. You want to ask effective questions, right? No one is going to volunteer for asking ineffective questions. However, it happens all the time. What book are you reading right now? I used to work with a guy who asked the cat question. That's what he called it, the cat question. Do you like cats? That was his question. I have no idea what he was trying to elicit with the cat question, although he asked every single person he interviewed, right? That's not a very effective question if you're hiring a financial analyst or you're hiring a person for your retail store. It just doesn't, that's meaningless, right? Again, whether you do or you don't, part of the diversity of life is some people like cats and some people don't. So it's not something that's appropriate for an interview. You want to ask each candidate the same question. And this is how you know when you're comparing people for the same role, how you know how they will perform on the job. You've asked all the same questions. This is part of that analysis and part of generating that data. You want to use detailed rating scales when you rate people after interviews from assessments. You really want to have a rating scale that you can look back at that is measurable, that is good, that tells you something about that candidate. You want to train interviewers. This is something that we are always told we need to do. We need to train people. We need to train all our managers on how to effectively interview people. Most managers groan when they hear that that's going to happen. Most people have a great time in interview training because the people who do it are fun and dynamic, but nobody will raise their hand and say, I want to go spend days in interview training. But it's so important to do, because when you do that, again, you build consistency and scalability, which drives a process that is consistent and scalable, which drives throughput, which drives production in your business, especially in high volume areas where you're hiring lots and lots of people. You want to use panel interviews or have more than one person interview someone. No candidate, I think, really likes a panel interview, but they can be very effective for a company. And most people interview with multiple people at a company, I would think. In most of our experience with our clients, candidates go through multiple interviews. But that's just something you can't forget. Don't ever get too into yourself and think, well, there's no reason that this team doesn't need to interact with this person I'm going to hire. That's just not true. People interact across a company. So it's important. Multiple people or interview panels. And then, you want to take notes. I think in terms of this bullet, I think in terms of shopping for a house. For those of you who've bought a house in the past, there's a day that you go out with your agent, and your agent shows you 10 houses. And you go back home, and you're going to evaluate and analyze each of the 10 houses that you saw. And you know what you can't remember? those 10 houses. You can't remember which one had the big backyard and which one had the jacuzzi pool and which one had the basement and which one had the hole in the roof. You know, you just can't remember anymore because you see too many people, and that's why you need to take notes. So I guess this is a dual best practice, one for buying real estate and one for interviewing people. Take notes, it'll help. I can't be the first one to ever tell somebody that. So as we carry on with the secrets to structured interviews, right, you need to be vigilant. You need to do the same things all the time. And that's not to say we're going to be boring about it. You can change questions assuming they're measuring the right things. You can change the interviewers assuming those interviewers have been trained the same way. But you got to be vigilant in running this process. Right? This is what, again, consistency and scalability will drive production. You want to get a phone preview. I don't think this is earth-shattering, but phone previews help you understand the other person without seeing them. And when we were talking about biases, again, this is a great way to prevent some biases. You can really draw out some rich information on the phone, follow up with it in person. The phone also saves a lot of time and a lot of money for all people involved, right? You go in for an in-person interview and you don't want to hire that person, you can end it, and it's more difficult to end it when they're sitting in front of you than it is when it's on the phone. And then the third part is take your time, and the point here is don't make snap judgments. Now, I realize I've just been advocating scalability and consistency and do this at a relatively good clip. Take your time does not mean draw out the process so that it takes a much longer period of time. Take your time means analyze the data that you have to ensure that you're making a healthy decision. If it's 4:30 p.m. and your day typically ends at 5 and you are, darn it, I'm going to get that offer out today, I just need 10 minutes to think about it. You know, it probably needs to take a little bit longer than 10 minutes. And don't rush it out in a half an hour. Sleep on it and do it first thing in the morning. You'll have a little bit more clarity. That's what we mean by take your time and not traffic and snap judgments. So that's getting rid of the unstructured interviews, right? That's our third best practice. Start thinking about structured interviews, interviews that drive data into making your hiring process. So the fourth best practice, check references without wasting time. If you think that reference checking is frustrating, like playing phone tag, doesn't return any usable data, gets a bunch of vague answers, you know, you're probably right, because that's what most people think of checking references in most cases, especially at high volume. But it doesn't have to be that way. And overwhelmingly, companies say, I don't have a good process in place to collect reference information. I just don't. I'd love to collect information on their past performance because I can see how that would help me, but I don't have a process. So what we're going to walk through here is a little bit about that process. So we really want to identify and answer these big three questions on the screen. Can this candidate do the job? Will this candidate do the job? And has this candidate done the job? Right? Those are really the three questions we need to answer, not only just in the interview process, but also when we check references. Well, the answer to this is not the, would you please give me a piece of paper with your references on there, and I'm going to have someone who's in their first job call and ask these people questions. That doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. What we want to do is apply some automation. We want to make the reference checking anonymous if it needs to be, because that anonymity tends to drive more honest feedback. And we want to give a better user experience. I mean, in my career, I've given people references, and I never know whether that person whether the company called that person. I never know that. Like, wouldn't it be great if as a candidate I knew that you checked my references? That'd be cool. I would, in fact, like it most often. And what we see with more automated, anonymous reference checks is completion rates near 80%. And go find me a company that has 80% completion rate on their reference checking process. It's a very high number for most reference checking processes. So here's what we're going to learn. Right? We're going to learn some very important demographic info. We're going to learn the date of hire and the title of the job you had, or of the candidate, the title the candidate had. And those things are important. We want to verify the truth in the resume, right? I mean, that's probably one of the first red flags anybody will tell you is, if you told me you worked somewhere and you didn't, I shouldn't be hiring you. So we can verify that demographic information. And then we want to talk a little bit about job duties, experience, and performance. That's what we're going to check. And then what we want to learn is we want to learn what it's like to work with that candidate, right? What they've achieved, what they're capable of, but not according to them, because we've probably asked them in an interview. We want to know what they're capable of from their peers and from their previous supervisors. That is just such added rich data for this process. And that's what's going to, why do you do it box, determine job fit and the potential for success. Right? So the reference checking process should really be asking similar types of questions that you would ask in an interview. You ask those in the reference checking process. This is a really important piece of information here. The same types of interviews in a reference check that you do in an interview. Because now you'll have consistent data on the person's performance. So with a little automation, we can increase the number of reference checks. With a process that is similar to an interview, we can increase the data we get from a reference check, and we can understand this person a little bit better, again, to help us make a more informed decision based on data rather than an informed decision based on a bias or a decision that's not informed at all. The next thing we want to do is we want to factor candidate experience into the ROI. Now, candidate experience is incredibly important. I think it gets overlooked a lot. I think it gets overlooked a lot as a part of a process. I think that companies and hiring managers talk about candidate experience a lot, but I'm not sure we have really cracked the code on this one yet, because what we want to do is we want to quantify candidate experience. We want to audit the tools we're using, and we want to understand what the impact of those tools and our process is on candidate experience. So let's talk a little bit about candidate experience. In general, it's not great. I would put it ain't great up here, but I didn't have enough room on the slide to put the word ain't and great. But I like ain't here better because it really drives home how unfortunate where we are with candidate experience is today. Employers are not sharing day-in-the-life information with candidates. Employers are not helping candidates prepare for an interview. And possibly the most despicable of the candidate experience stats is new hires don't receive phone calls from their hiring manager during the onboarding process. What? That's just not right. And this is the candidate experience. Remember, I said it's not just about the candidate. It's about when in the early days when you're a new hire. And if you're the hiring manager and you're not talking to your new hires, how long do you think they're going to stay? They're going to feel totally out of it, and they're going to feel disenfranchised from the organization that seemed to want them so much. So candidate experience is not great. So what we want to do is we want to begin to ask a bunch of questions that will help us extract the importance in our candidate experience. We want to understand, why would someone want to work for us? We think we know the answer to that, but how often do we actually ask and discuss the answer to that. Right? What level of visibility do we have into our employees and into our talent pool? Do we know what people like about the business, why they work here, what their passions are, what drives them? Those are all incredibly important inputs to the selection process. What's the perception of our employees to our employment brand, of our candidates to our employment brand? We need the answers to those to understand where those people, where those candidates, how they see our business. You know, how many of our employees are going to recommend our company as a great place to work? We need to know that, because if we're going out and telling candidates this is a great place to work, and as it turns out nobody here thinks it's a great place to work, you know, those misalignments, those will kill your selection process. And then, which of our managers have received training on how to deliver the brand experience? Again, just like interviewing training, you know, very few people are going to raise their hand to do this, but it's got such an impact across the organization, and that's where we need to look, right? This isn't just I'm hiring one person for my team. This is a cultural, organizational impact that your selection process should be having, and you're gathering data. You got to get the best person you possibly can. So these are some of the questions you need to ask to begin that process. You know, we want to make it personal. Here are some things we can do to boost our candidate experience. One, you want to walk in the job seeker's shoes. Right? So I think in terms of professional golfers. When they play a match, they play a round, they are going to visualize the course. They're going to play the course before they actually play the course. They're playing the course in their head. Or if you're a mountain climber, and if you're Alex Honnold, you have rehearsed every move you're going to make as you climb up the face of El Capitan, because you know what's at stake. And that's what we want to do. We want to walk in the job seeker's shoes before that person becomes a job seeker with us in their sights. So we understand what their experiences are, where they might not think, where they think they're going to find a foothold, but they might not. You need to communicate. You've got to communicate every step of that selection process so that they know where they stand. They know what to expect. You want to bring your employees into this process. Role play someone through the whole process. Ask one of your employees to pretend like they're a candidate and apply through the whole process. You'll see where those pitfalls are very quickly. You don't want to personalize this recruiting process. Your recruiting process, your talent selection process should not be a bureaucratic machine, because you're not hiring bureaucrats. You're hiring real people who most likely are going to interact with real people and your prospective customers. You want that real people connection. And you want to seek honest feedback. How was that process? People you hire, you want to ask them how that process was. And in fact, people you choose not to hire, you want to ask them how that process was. It's just like in sales, when you go and you analyze why someone would have chosen to buy and why someone chose a competitor. It's the same type of analysis, same type of learning. We're just applying it to the selection process. So as you look through candidate experience, you realize this best practice in and of itself will open up all sorts of areas for improvement, opportunities that we have. In fact, things we're doing well. It's not difficult to do, but you have to take the time to do it. And the sixth best practice, gather performance data before the one-year review. And again, let's remind ourselves of my one colleague who thinks that 1 year is crazy, thinks that it needs to be 90 days. The most organizations wait for a year or more before they collect feedback. If you have a high volume, high turnover environment, you don't get a chance for a year. And if you have a relatively low turnover environment, you may not get a chance for a year either, because someone might forget what they originally thought that far down the road. This is incredibly important to get there within 90 days. And what you want to be doing is you want to collect data. especially if you're in a high volume, you're in a decentralized type of business. Gosh, collecting this data can be so important to understanding how your regions operate, understanding the effectiveness of your managers, right? So you're going to gather objective metrics like turnover. You're going to gather what's called a job reacceptance metric, which is an awfully jargony term for would you take this job again if you were offered it. That's a very telling result. If somebody says no, you better jump on that right away and find out what that no means. That person may be a foot out the door. Right? Satisfaction of an employee, overall satisfaction. What that onboarding and training program is, the results of that program, and that person's performance, that specific person's performance in onboarding and training, and then their overall engagement, right? You can develop your own engagement metric, but a lot of these, turnover, reacceptance, satisfaction, onboarding, and training metrics play into that overall engagement metric as well. And again, high volume, decentralized environments, absolutely critical because you're not there looking at your team. But let's say you manage a call center. You still have high volume. You're all in one place, but you may not have that immediate impact, immediate interaction with every single candidate and every single new hire. So as you look to evaluate your hiring process, we're going to look at this onboarding engagement part 2. Right? So evaluating the hiring process, one of the pieces, and we touched a little bit about this earlier, is providing a realistic job preview. Pull up a chair, do a couple sales calls, shadow a server, sit on the floor and watch people work. It's more than just a tour through the office. It's some realistic job preview to let your candidates experience the role. You let them experience the role. You will not only weed out people who say, oops, I didn't think that was what it was going to be, so that's not for me. You will find people who the job is for. And those people who get excited about that, they'll probably have suggestions for you after that ride-along, quote, ride-along, that they'll do. And they'll come up with suggestions. So then there are other factors here, right? Are your managers creating dissatisfaction? You want to understand that. Training. Is training too long? What's the pass rate? Is it too hard to get through the training process? Or is what you're measuring actually important in the training process? And is there a correlation between training and job success? This is really important because if there's no correlation there, then you got to revamp your training process. And all of this goes into measuring employee impact, right? This is really the output of your selection process, the impact that an employee has on your business. You can understand this impact data. You can couple it with turnover rates. You can understand high impact, lower turnover. You can see impact, greater the impact. What source did all these great impactful employees come from? These are all the pieces that you've got when you're able to follow up and engage your new employees in the first 90 days. And then you can take what you've learned and you can put it back into that selection process. You can create a closed loop process here. I mean, these jargony terms, scalability, consistency, closed loop, but when you're thinking about this process, isn't that what you want? You want consistency and scalability. You want to gather some data where you can learn something. And then you want to put that back into the selection process and make that selection process even better than you've already made it. So let's summarize these best practices, right? Making sure your job criteria makes sense. You want to gain a more diverse, speedy, productive selection process. Look at job potential, not just past experience. Make hiring decisions with more certainty, less risk. Right? That's kind of sums it up right there. Reduce bias when you do structured interviews. So stop doing casual, unstructured interviews. I want to check references without wasting time. Answer these questions. Can they do the job? Will they do the job? Have they done the job? Factor in candidate experience. Make it personal. Walk in the job seeker's shoes. And in order to know if your best practices are working, you want to understand the impact that your new employees are having. Get to them in the first 90 days. Ask them how they're working. And I'll open it up for questions. Dan, if you'd help facilitate the questions, if anybody has any, you can put your questions into the panel on the side. And Dan, if there are any, I'm happy to answer them.
You know, what's great, some questions did come in. What's great about the webinar, all the information there, you answered the questions. So it's
that's very nice of you. Thank you.
If I did miss that, though, if anybody did have a question and you missed Jason's explanation in slides that came later, you know, you can certainly always reach us. But yeah, you've answered.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate your time with us. And Dan, you want to tell them about the next webinar event?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So coming August 11th, we're going to talk about coaching. Coaching in the moment specifically. We'll give some tips on how to get better at engaging in that aspect. Like I said, if we did miss something or you didn't hear an answer to your question, info@outmatch.com is the email address to send that information to. You can always get us at outmatch.com for our excellent resources and blog section. And at OutMatch HCM on Twitter. And if you use the hashtag OutMatch Insights, we'll see it right away. Thanks everybody for joining us. We will see you next time, August 11th. Take care.